There is no round table around, but, well, I'm not really familiar with this monstrous. Okay.
You're supposed to be a high-tech man.
Yes, but your computer is a low-tech computer. Just click on it.
You took it.
We're beginning with pleasantries, are we?
Okay. It will come. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. Before it is too late, by the way, and I'm not as alarmed as Professor Pim is by the fact that the Wikipedia entry is so short. I wouldn't mind to see it completely empty. But no, it takes some. I suppose it takes some time. I mean, if the computer is so slow and weak, yes. No, nothing happened. Yes. Okay. Okay. I'm not, in principle, I'm not against inventing new terms, coining new terms. In the case of the definition of cultural translation, as it appears in Wikipedia, I don't really see any advantage in coining this term, and I think that in translation studies and in many other fields we can do very well without it. Not that it causes any harm. I mean, if people want to use the term cultural translation for dealing with transformations and change in culture, they may do that. But it is so typical, highly typical of the undefined field of Anglo-American cultural studies that they always make simple things complex and complex things trivial. So they believe that by inventing new terminology they will solve issues that need to be tackled, and it has been the routine for the last 15 odd years, and happily I do not consider myself to be any part of cultural studies in that tradition, and since I've been doing work in culture research for a number of years, I simply invented the term culture research, and I'm happy to say that in many centers around the world it is a term that is in use. So I have no objection to cultural translation being used for dealing with transformation and change in society, but I, in short, don't see any advantage. And I would suggest that we who are still interested in translation keep the term translation to refer to processes where we have both source and target. If we have to deal with larger context processes, I think we can use the term transfer, as is mentioned even in this short entry. That is, we can speak of cultural transfer to refer to any process or procedure of moving certain items from one source to one target, or between sources that may be unidirectional or bidirectional or multidirectional. And if we wish to deal with what we are doing normally in translation, whether it is textual or non-textual translation, that we continue using the term translation. So the sense of cultural translation given here is simply superfluous, perhaps even counterproductive. On the other hand, I can see some use for the term cultural translation to design some other processes and phenomena. First of all, on a very elementary level, many kinds of textual and non-textual translations are cultural translations. For instance, when you translate one text from one language to another, and you modify the text in such a way that it be understood by the target culture, you indispensably carry out, execute cultural translation. I mean, for instance, if any text whatsoever. So, in a way, many students of translation have said for quite a long time now that almost any kind of translation is also a cultural translation. Some translations are more cultural translations than others. So this is more or less simple use for the term cultural translation. We can also, perhaps, I'm not sure it is very useful or convincing or necessary, we can perhaps use the term cultural translation to refer to practices where we have to explain to people in one culture what is going on in another culture. That is, when we have to guide people who go to other cultures or to other societies, how to behave and how they might understand what is going on. The Dutch student of culture, Hofstede, Geert Hofstede, speaks a lot about cultural misunderstandings, and he has created various dimensions to describe different cultures, and he, as a result of his knowledge, has been able to set up practical courses to teach people what is expecting them in the other culture. So he's doing a lot of translation in this respect, at least metaphorically, but sometimes literally, verbal translations, to explain to people what they might expect. He speaks a lot about culture shock people get when they move from one culture to another. Disastrous stories about, he's got plenty of anecdotes about people who move from one country to another, for instance, within large international concerns such as IBM. Yes, whole families have to translocate, say, from the United States to France, and then an American lady, an American woman, an American wife of some IBM worker cannot gets terribly depressed, and because she cannot get out of her home in France, Cannes, because she is not familiar with what is going on in the supermarket, and even the street is too frightening for her. So she needs some preparation. The husband also needs some preparation, Hofstede said, because otherwise he would not be able to understand what his French colleagues are going to tell him, even those French colleagues are going to speak some French English with him. It's not a matter of language. And so you can find a lot of such examples in Hofstede's work. And as a result of the commercial success of the Hofstede enterprise, various consulting companies around the world have set up services of consultation to people who go abroad or who have to have negotiations with companies abroad. And there are some 20 companies around the world I've been able to locate. One of them, to honor Professor Pym, is located in Australia, and they have a lovely website, and you are cordially invited to look at the website, because you will find extraordinary documents explaining to you what it takes, for instance, if I take one of the documents here, what it takes when you have to move or understand, when you move from cultures who have a monochronic relation to time to societies or cultures that have a polychronic relation to time. People who have a monochronic relation to time do only one activity at a time. People who belong to polychronic time culture do many activities at a time. Monochronic concentrate on and are committed to the job. Polychronic are easily distracted, subject to interruptions, and are committed to the people. Monochronic time is sizable and measurable. Polychronic appointments are approximate and subject to giving time to significant others. Monochronic keep appointments strictly, schedule in advance, and do not run late. Polychronic schedules are generally subordinate to relationships. Polychronic relationships are generally subordinate to schedule. Polychronic strong preference for following where relationships lead. And the last item, monochronic emphasize promptness. Polychronic base promptness on the relationship. And so they tell you how difficult it is to move from what we call Western culture to some non-Western cultures, and how it causes so many misunderstandings. They take great effort, they invest great endeavors in explaining, translating, as it were, the other culture for you. And then when you go from Sydney to Singapore, from Sydney to Bangkok, you are no longer worried. You know what you might expect. And there are many such cases. I don't want to take too much of your time. Now, for instance, a colleague, a semiotician from Brazil, now located at the University of North Carolina in the United States, Monica Rector, gave several years ago a paper which she called Cross-Cultural Understanding, the American Ghost, and she actually deals with with various instances that might be called cultural translation, in the sense that she takes the effort to describe in her paper what need be done in order to allow people who move from one culture to another, such as immigrants, temporary as well as non-temporary immigrants, to know something about the culture in which they find themselves all of a sudden. For instance, she says, a migrant or any foreigner who comes to the United States needs a cultural orientation. The individual has to be provided with a model for understanding and predicting the results of intercultural encounters. What can this model do? It can make the newcomer aware of how the other culture speaks, acts, negotiates, and makes decisions. This does not mean that it is intended for the newcomer to learn how to imitate the native. It is only a survival device. In Rome, the Romans, something is wrong here. A cultural orientation model has to organize and process information, etc. And then she goes into, in great detail, into the various possibilities. But what she is doing, in fact, is not only giving you clues for cultural orientation, but tools for making concrete translations, as it were, that are needed. You translate. You say, when an American tells you, let's have lunch sometime, this does not mean that you now must make an appointment for lunch. Yes? Or I would say, when an Israeli tells you, I'll make an effort to be at your lecture, this means I will not be able to come. So you do not get disappointed. This is a serious matter, although it sounds trivial. I mean, if you are new in the United States and you've got no friends, and someone all of a sudden suggests that you take lunch together, and you rejoice in the possibility of finally, after 2 months of indifference, you've got the first friend in the new world, and then you get terribly disappointed because this never happens. This is cultural translations. Have I got 2 more minutes? Then I would like simply to show you what I would not call, but I could possibly think of the possibility of using the term cultural translation for such cases. Yes? You see, this is on a cornflakes box, and it from Canada, so it is bilingual, and then it has got 2 languages. And in English it says, to open, slide finger under tab and break seal to left and right. While the French says, pour ouvrir, soulevez la languette, glissez votre doigt de gauche à droite. Meaning, to open, lift the tab and slide your finger from left to right. Why left and right, you know? And here, and only left to right here. And why you immediately get information to slide finger on the tab here, and here you don't get it, but you are told to soulever la languette, and then you have to push your finger. I'm not going to interpret that, although I have many hypotheses about that, just trying to give you the example. In contradistinction to the instructions we get in Tel Aviv when we have this cornflakes box, because what we have here, see, to open, lift the tab. It says, that's it. Well, I can tell I have no doubt about the fact that if you tell an Israeli, lift the tab and move your finger left and right, I mean, that would be ridiculous. I mean, who are you to tell me what to do with my finger? Yes? Or do you think I'm such an idiot that I wouldn't find a way myself? All this, of course, under the assumption which is not sustained at all, that people read these texts. Yes? Most people don't look at them at all. I simply haven't got the time for that, but I'll try. Yes, this is what I wanted to show you, which probably might be called cultural translation in the sense I've been discussing. You see, this is from Swiss chocolate Destler with Dutch and French as an explanatory text. And I'll read the French first. Appréciez la finesse, le goût exquis de ce délicieux chocolat. Préparé avec du bon lait Nestlé et selon les meilleures traditions suisses. It's almost a poem, isn't it? Very elegantly appreciate the delicacy, finesse, and taste, exquisite taste of this delicious chocolate prepared with with good milk Nestle, the good Nestle milk, and according to the best Swiss traditions. Now the Dutch. Proef hoe fijn deze chocolade smaakt. Try how nice this chocolate tastes. Mmm, verrukkelijk. Yes, you see? Mmm, verrukkelijk. That is, terrific, terrific, terrific. Hij is bereid, it is prepared. met lekkere Nestle melk en dit volgens de beste Zwitserse tradities. Nothing could be more different, I believe. These two cultures, or these two textual cultures, at least, yes, if it would be too much to say about cultures, couldn't be more different. It is absolutely unthinkable that such a phrase, terrific, would ever appear in a French text. Of course, this is not a singular example. I've got many such examples that show you the difference between Dutch and French. And I'll give you very briefly one more example, which is taken from this. You see, again, a bowl of cornflakes. I'm grateful to José Lambert and his wife Mia for this example that set me up on the road. I've been collecting these small texts since 40 years. Yes, this is the anniversary of the beginning of my collection, more or less, because it was, I believe, in the year 76. This is from 76. But it repeats itself ad nauseam, I would say. So you see what happens here? I'll read the English. We know how difficult, English translation, we know how difficult it is sometimes to eat cereals from an ordinary dish. We know that especially with children, more lands on the table than in their mouths. You see? We weten dat vooral bij kinderen meestal meer op tafel belandt dan in hun mond. Yes, that's okay. Therefore, we have chosen for the little friends has a word in Dutch, vriendjes, you see. Dutch is very fond of diminutives. And the feasters of Kellogg's, a special breakfast bowl. Now, suppose the Dutch was the original and the French, this is from Belgium, also a bilingual country, so it appears like in Canada, they have to have two languages. Suppose, just for the assumption that this were the original and this is the translator, the French translator has got terrible cultural problems because he probably can't possibly mention children. He can't possibly, like with the chocolate, mention situations connected with non-elegant and non-delicate activities such as filth falling on the table. I mean, uncleanliness. This is not something you talk about. You've got it in the reality of French life, of course, naturally, but you can't talk about it. So you see what the French has done. We at Colleagues know that there is often a little problem. Yes, un petit problème. When serving cereal to whom? It's not mentioned. Hollow dishes are too large for whom? Bowls are too deep, cups too small. So we have made to order especially for you a delightful cereal bowl. That's not the same situation, wouldn't you agree? It is perhaps a case of, it is a cultural transposition. It is a cultural translation. And any knowledge of French in the world won't make you be capable of producing such a text unless you knew for sure that children must not be mentioned. And of course, I'm not even referring to the different phrasing that makes the French text conform to the time-honored classical traditions of elegance. And look here on a packet of dry biscuits that is called in Dutch. Where is the Dutch? Oh, okay. It's called in German Matzen, Matzos. It's taken from Hebrew matzot. So the English says children love them. You see? No children in French. You won't find them in French. You won't find them in German either. And of course you won't find them in this ridiculous text. that's written in Dutch Yiddish. This is the original. I've taken it from here. And so on. So we haven't got the time, but this is a very small sample of such examples. So perhaps it might be justified. I say perhaps because I'm not even sure about that either. That we may use the term cultural translation to design or to refer to those texts where you cannot simply render the same sort of information. Even I skipped one example. If we will have some time later, I can show you one more example where you even get different instructions, not only general text, but different instructions on how to handle a tool, which are probably also culturally constrained or constrained by the culture. This is more or less what I've got to say at this round, and I leave the floor to my learned friend here on the right. Would you?
From left to right?
From left to right.
Sliding the finger from
Yes.
left to right.
Do you need the computer?
Let's go ahead anyhow. Thank you very much, Itamar. And now that Anthony is almost back in the room, yeah, he is. Thank you, Anthony, as well, for this occasion, for making it possible, for inviting me. When I was leaving the hotel this morning, I thought I would begin with an original coinage of my own, a sentence I had just invented, to the effect that I'm delighted to be here. But having arrived here, I do not know whether I wish to say that with as much delight or enthusiasm as when I had left the hotel. I noticed that we began by Anthony paying what he called homage to others who had spoken here before. I know I'm getting older and older, but I do not know whether I'm ready for a homage to be paid to me yet. But I have qualified for it, it seems anyhow, by coming here and speaking here. I know it's a museum, and it does make one feel old. Anthony's fondest hope, which he has not expressed directly out of politeness, is that sometime during the session, my dear friend Itamar and I would be at each other's throats. That is the idea of arranging something like this. He has brought us together here from different places, from around the globe, just to do that. It might yet happen, but my take on cultural translation is so entirely different from Itamar's that we may be like ships passing at night and not colliding. Anthony said that the term cultural translation has not been registered by most students of translation studies, and that is perfectly correct. Only the Wikipedia knows about it, and I know about it. And I am older than Wikipedia, and I was there before. In the late 1990s, I actually presented a paper. The first outing of that paper was at the University of Iowa in the USA. This is the late 1990s, and the title of that paper was Translating Culture versus Cultural Translation. Having written that paper, I thought I had got on to something which I considered very important. And therefore, I broke all academic protocol thereafter by giving various versions of the paper over and over again at as many places as I possibly could. And this is the latest in that series. What is even worse in terms of academic protocol is that I'm going on giving this paper in its many avatars, even though I have published it already. It was first published in a web journal that comes out of the University of Iowa. It's called the 91st Meridian. It was then published in a journal in India. It was then published in a book in India, and therefore I cannot blame anyone for not having read it. But then it was reprinted, the whole book, not only my article, by Benjamins, who are one of the greatest publishers in the world on translation. And still nobody has read it, which is my justification for going on doing this paper to as many people as possible. If you do not read me, whenever I can capture you in a room, you'll have to listen to me. The other reason for my going on doing this paper is that I feel that cultural translation, the rise of cultural translation, is an extremely dangerous development. We need to stop it as soon as we can. Translating culture is one thing. But cultural translation, this new terminology, this new phrase, it seems to me is extremely deleterious to the health of translation. And if we do not do something to contain it straight away, it would have swallowed up translation as we have always known it, and that, from my point of view, from where I come from, would not be a good thing at all. As I said, I have a paper. I do not have slides, I do not have cornflake boxes, but I do have a paper. I will not read all of it. In the beginning here, I traced very briefly how translation studies have got where they have. Translation has never been so big in the history of the world. It's been noticed more. Translation has always been big. What was the Renaissance, if not a major act of translation? But translation has been recognized to be translation. Translation has become visible as translation. And translation is being systematically analyzed and studied now in a way that is unprecedented. Since the late or mid-1970s or the 1980s, there has been something that we call translation studies as a separate or semi-separate academic discipline or subdiscipline. And that has led to a consolidation of how we read translation, how we approach translation in a way that, as I said, had never been done before. How did translation begin to be studied? It's a recent phenomenon. Earlier, it was part of linguistics. The assumption was that translation was the transaction between two languages, and therefore the proper field under which to study it would be linguistics. This continued for a long time. Then, there was also, parallel to that, the idea that translation was actually part of comparative literature. And that was another broader umbrella under which translation was parked for quite some time. Translation has now emerged from both these long shadows to become, for some of us, if not for all of us, a discipline or at least a subdiscipline. That is a development, an academic development that needs a disciplinary development that needs to be noted and that perhaps needs to be celebrated and welcomed. Meanwhile, well, there was also a hope. Briefly, after the cultural turn in translation studies, as some theorists of translation have called it, most notably Susan Bassnett and André Lefebvre. After the cultural turn in translation studies, hope was expressed, again in the late 1990s, in a book that the two of them published, that there might be a corresponding and responsive translation turn in cultural studies. That the two new subdisciplines or disciplines should join forces and do the work that they have carved out as separate territories, though really it belongs to both together. In that book that I referred to, published in 1998, I think it was, Constructing Cultures, Bassnett and Lefebvre said, and I quote, "In these multifaceted interdisciplines," and they mean translation studies and cultural studies. In these multifaceted interdisciplines, isolation is counterproductive. The study of translation, like the study of culture, needs a plurality of voices. And similarly, the study of culture always involves an examination of the processes of encoding and decoding that comprise translation. But nothing happened. This appeal on the part of two of the top experts in translation studies of our times fell on deaf cultural studies ears. They did not respond. They were growing at an enormous rate anyhow. Cultural studies are the big headlines from a disciplinary point of view of the last 3 or 4 decades. Everybody wants to do cultural studies. And one of the reasons was suggested by Terry Eagleton. He said, if you do cultural studies, you can plonk yourself down in front of the TV set and get up 4 years later with a PhD. That's what cultural studies are about, in many people's view. So everybody wants a share of that. Now, what happened meanwhile was that the term cultural, translating culture was always part of translation, in the senses described by Itamar, except 1 or 2, to which I'll return. But it was not called cultural translation. About 8 or 10 years ago, I forget now precisely when, I checked the British Library catalogue, typing in the phrase cultural translation, and only one book came up, which was about the first of the many meanings that Itamar referred to, a translation into Spanish, I think, of a text which was oriented deliberately towards the Spanish reader and therefore in that sense could be called cultural translation. That was the only sense available 10 years back among the many resources, the profound resources of the British Library. Last year, a few months back, I typed in cultural translation again in the BL catalogue, and now they have 11 books. It's been happening before our eyes. And the sad thing is that people who do translation studies have not noticed it. They're beginning to notice it only now. The Wikipedia entry is perfectly right in one word, when it says cultural studies is a new development in translation. It's very new. How new? There is an encyclopedia of translation studies done by Mona Baker, and it does not have an entry on cultural translation. There is a translation studies reader edited by Larry Venuti, and it does not have cultural translation even in the index. That's how new it is. And why was it ignored by translation studies? Why not ignored deliberately? Why were translation studies ignorant of this development? Because it arose elsewhere. Because the term arose in another field of study, with which translation studies does not wish to have much to do, it seems. And that field is, again, a large field, a booming field, which is postcolonialism, postcolonial discourse. There was this term available in anthropology already. In the 1960s, there was a book published called Cultural Translation. It was a festschrift for Evans Pritchard, the great British anthropologist. The title is Cultural Translation. Inside the book, there is not a single reference to cultural translation. The term is never explained. Nobody knows what it is. And that perhaps is for the reason that at that stage of the evolution of anthropology, everybody was in tacit agreement about what cultural translation is in anthropological terms. It was going and observing another culture from inside it, coming back and writing it up, but in writing it up, not using a single word from the language of that other culture, describing it in one's own language. That was called cultural translation. Of course, anthropologists have never succeeded in doing that. There is this taboo that one should not use the language of the observed culture, except that the word taboo comes from one such language. This is a self-non-fulfilling condition. Now it's been discussed again in terms of the term cultural translation and been problematized to some extent in anthropology, particularly by James Clifford, whose major contribution, James Clifford has revolutionized anthropology, at least theoretically. He has shifted the paradigm in a very big way, and is extremely popular and trendy and fashionable among anthropologists. And what he says is, among many other things, that the best place to observe cultures is not in a remote village, but in airport lounges. The best place to analyze culture is not, again, through in situ objects far away. Why bother? It can be done in museums. It can be better done in museums. So he's made that kind of a contribution, and this is a new version of cultural translation as anthropologists understand it. But I wish to devote a few minutes to where I think the term first gained currency, the post-colonial discourse, and how it is that the term now comes into translation studies with all that post-colonial baggage, which people in translation studies haven't the foggiest clue to. That's why it's a mismatch. If there is one thing that cultural translation is not in post-colonial discourse, it is the translation of culture. It's as absurd, or as they say in theory, as characteristic a use of the term cultural translation as that. In fact, it spells out, as I'm going to argue, the very extinction and erasure of translation as we have always known and cherished it. The most comprehensive, sophisticated, and influential formulation of the concept of cultural translation occurs in the work of probably the foremost post-colonial / postmodernist theorist of our times, Homi Bhabha. It is in the last chapter, bar the conclusion of his book, The Location of Culture, his only book, 1994, titled, and the chapter is titled, How Newness Enters the World, Postmodern Space, Post-Colonial Times, and the Trials of Cultural Translation. That's the first major use of this term in that chapter title that I have been able to track down in post-colonial studies. In Bhabha's discussion, the literary text treated as the preeminent example of cultural translation is Salman Rushdie's novel Satanic Verses, a novel written originally in English and read in English by Homi Bhabha, but he still calls it cultural translation. A clue to the new sense in which the term translation is being used here in the phrase cultural translation is suggested by a remark made by Rushdie himself, which Bhabha does not cite in his article, but which is cited frequently everywhere else, in which Rushdie said of himself and other diasporic writers, "We are translated men." This he said a long time back. Rushdie is here exploiting the etymology of the word translation, which means to carry or to bear across, and what he meant therefore was that because he had been borne across, presumably in an aeroplane, from India and Pakistan to the United Kingdom, he was therefore a translated man. He does not tell us whether before getting onto that airport he was ever an original man. I mentioned this to Ngugi Thiong'o in a conversation I had with him, a post-colonial writer for whose use of language, switching from English to his own language, Gikuyu, in mid-career, I have a tremendous amount of respect. He is a true post-colonial writer in a way that most post-colonial writers that we talk about, who are Anglophone writers and who are sleeping with the enemy, as John Updike said, in using the English language, are not. Ngugi Thiong'o said to me, I said, Rushdie says he's a translated man. Do you feel similarly? And he said, no, not at all. I am a transported man. He was exiled from his country for his political attitudes and writings. So he said, I'm a transported man in the older sense. when criminals were transported. But a second and overriding sense in which too Rushdie claimed to be a translated man is the sense exploited by Homi Bhabha in that essay. Bhabha begins with an epigraph from Walter Benjamin's classic essay on translation, and I'm quoting Bhabha, quoting Benjamin. He says, translation passes through continua of transformation, not abstract ideas of identity and similarity. Later, developing this, Bhabha brings in Derrida's deconstruction of Benjamin's concept of translation as an afterlife or survival in order to deploy this concept in a wholly new context unintended by either Benjamin or Derrida. And this new context is the context of Rushdian migrancy and hybridity. Allow me to quote a passage from Homi Bhabha. It's not so early in the morning. I hope you've had breakfast. I hope you're not feeling too feeble. If hybridity, I quote Bhabha, if hybridity is heresy, then to blaspheme is to dream. I hope you got that one. It sounds so wonderful. It's so poetic. I'll read it again. If hybridity is heresy, then to blaspheme is to dream. It is the dream of translation as survival. As Derrida translated the time of Benjamin's concept of the afterlife of translation as survivre, the act of living on borderlines. Rushdie, this is still Bhabha, Rushdie translates this into the migrant's dream of survival, an initiatory interstices, an empowering condition of hybridity. I could quote more, but what's the use? We get the drift of what he's trying to do. He is transferring the word translation by attaching it to the word cultural from any transaction between two languages, from two cultures. No. He now means by it a person traveling, the hybridity of the migrant from one place to another with no reference to language. This is what Bhabha is in favor of. This is what Bhabha supports. This is what Bhabha means by cultural translation. What he calls cultural translation is, firstly, what he means by it, that he does not mean literary translation. He does not mean linguistic translation. What he means is the process and condition of human migrancy. He has a lovely phrase for it. He always has wonderful phrases. He calls it the translational transnational, which is the condition of Western multiculturalism brought about by third world migrancy. Since Bhabha first articulated it, the distinctly postmodernist idea of cultural translation in this non-textual, non-linguistic sense has found an echo in much contemporary writing, both critical and creative. I'll cite a couple of examples. There's a Pakistani writer. He's called a Pakistani writer, but that's problematic. There's a writer, British writer, called Hanif Qureshi, much acclaimed in post-colonial circles, who talks about cultural translation in this new sense. Unlike Rushdie, Qureshi had one English parent. Qureshi was born in England, not in Bombay or any part of India or Pakistan. He grew up in Kent, a home county. And he thought of himself as quite and completely British rather than Indian or Pakistani or even hybrid. To quote Qureshi, I was brought up really as an English child. I wasn't influenced by Asian culture at all, he says. As he put it in another interview, I'm not a Pakistani or an Indian writer, I'm a British writer. And this shows in his work. He does not know any Hindi film songs, judging by his fiction. He instead edited the Faber Book of Pop. He's so intensely English that Faber asked him to edit the Faber Book of Pop. That's where he comes from. He has at least one book, Sleep With Me, which has only British white characters. The only difficulty with such Britishness of Qureshi that in the literary and cultural world of London in the 1970s, when he first attempted literary writing and writing for the TV and attempted to make a name for himself, the people who could commission this kind of work looked on him as very un-British. As Qureshi says, they required, and I quote Qureshi, they required stories about the new immigrant British communities by cultural translators, as it were, to interpret one side to the other. And Qureshi says he knew that as a non-migrant, he knew nothing about all that. But he perhaps looked the part, perhaps he had the right kind of name in white British eyes, and therefore he was given that kind of work. That's the only kind of work he was given in the beginning. So he says he knew that he was, and again I quote, not the sort of writer best suited to this kind of work. But he did it nevertheless because he says, I just knew I was being paid to write. In this version, and this is a point that needs to be emphasized, in this version, cultural translation is not the need of the migrant. Even within this narrow context, it's not the need of the migrant, as Bhabha makes it out to be, but rather more a requirement of the society and culture to which the migrant has traveled. It is this kind of cultural translation, it is a hegemonic Western demand and necessity. There's another example that I'll give of Jhumpa Lahiri, again a subcontinental sounding writer who was born in England, grew up in America, and was the first Indian, even Rushdie has not done it, was the first Indian to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. She wrote a book called, her first book, Interpreter of Maladies. The title itself is resonant to translation. Interpreter of Maladies, Stories of Bengal, Boston and Beyond. I like the alliteration. Bengal, Boston and beyond. Boston is a city, Bengal is a province, and I don't know where beyond is. So she was the first writer to win the Pulitzer Prize. And when her book traveled to India, it was published in America. When it was reprinted in India and some of us read it, the reviewers pointed out that she did not know what she was talking about. Her knowledge of India was extremely inadequate. That's what some of the reviewers said. They were glaring howlers. How did she respond, Jhumpa Lahiri? She said, she admitted this, but look at the terms in which she admitted it. She said, I am the first person to admit that my knowledge of India is limited, in the way all translations are. Why malign translation? Why bring translation into it? She's not translating. But she couples what she is doing as original creative writing, not translated from any other language, with translation. And she develops this idea. She seems to be very fond of this idea. She says that her representation of India is in fact her translation of India, quote unquote. She says further, and she goes further now, almost all of my characters are translators, not only she herself. Almost all of my characters are translators, insofar as they must make sense of the foreign to survive. I think she has read Homi Bhabha's essay. The kind of intertextuality that we find now between creative writing of a particular kind, especially post-colonial kind, and post-colonial theory and criticism is quite astounding. There is a circulation of terminology at least. And then at the end of this article, Jhumpa Lahiri says, and whether I write as an American or an Indian about things American or Indian or otherwise, one thing remains constant. I translate, therefore I am. A little later, her book Interpreter of Maladies was translated into Bengali, which is the language of her parents, even if it may not have been her own language. She heard it constantly around her. at her home in America, also when they went back for vacations to India. And when this book was translated into Bengali, Jhumpa Lahiri could not read it. The great translator who exists because she is a translator, she could not read it. But look at the way she put it. She said that that Bengali translation remained inaccessible to me, as if it was the translation's fault in remaining inaccessible. If this is cultural translation, we perhaps need to worry about the very meaning of the word translation. One wonders why translation should be the word of choice in a collocation such as cultural translation. In this new sense, when perfectly good and theoretically sanctioned words for this new phenomenon, such as migrancy, exile, diaspora, and in the senses, I hate to say this, but Itamar showed that even he, when he wants to, can do anything. Even he can make complex things trivial. This is the closest I'm getting to what you want. Okay. Now, reading cornflake boxes and chocolate boxes is absolutely wonderful. This is what we do when we have nothing else to do. And then we go on to interpret it on academic occasions. But is this what translation has come to in the phrase cultural translation? Is this going to be the primary meaning of cultural translation? It seems to me that such abuse of the term translation is also mirrored and magnified by the use of the word translation in any other kind of context generally. For example, people say, Obama seems to be popular, but let's see whether that translates into votes. He has a lot of talent, but let's see whether that translates into achievement. This has been common usage even earlier, metaphorically. But here we've gone further. Even that usage of translation is not, I don't know whether there's any need for it, because there are many other words available to us. And if the word translation is used in those other contexts, what it seems to suggest, what it does in effect is to dilute the meaning of translation through further diffusion. And that may be a wonderful thing for everybody who uses English every day in common use, but it's not such a good thing for people who are professionally and seriously academically involved with translation. It's like the use of the word politics. Everything has a politics to it. There was a semantic explosion in the meaning of the word politics after Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics. Now there is the politics of open spaces, there is the politics of drainage, there's the politics of sewage, there's the politics of everything. That, in some senses, is what's beginning to happen to the word translation. Why do I want to protect this territory? Because I'm old and old-fashioned? That's always one reason. Not moving with the times, but there's another reason. That is why I feel that I must, with whatever resources at my command, keep fighting this battle against cultural translation. And the major implication of this for me is that in this post-colonial, post-modernist world, where newness constantly enters through cultural translation, the need to protect some little space for old and old-fashioned literary translation is because if we do not do this, if we do not protect that space, that, if you like, ecological space of a balance culturally between languages, then sooner than later we shall end up with a wholly translated, monolingual, monocultural, monolithic world. And I will not even go into monochronic. This is the danger as I see it. And then those of us who are still bilingual and who are still untranslated from our own native ground to an alien shore will nevertheless have been translated against our will and against our grain. Further, translation itself would have been untranslated or detranslated, for it would have come under erasure, in a sense rather less deconstructive than Derrida's, but plainly more destructive. The post-colonial would have thoroughly colonized translation. For translation in the sense that we have known and practiced it, and the value that it has possessed as an instrument of discovery and exchange would have ceased to exist. Rather than help us encounter and experience other cultures, translation would have been assimilated in just one monolingual global culture. All the recent talk of multiculturalism relates, it may be noted, not to the many different cultures located all around the world, but merely to the expedient social management of a small sample of migrants from some of those cultures who have dislocated themselves, displaced themselves, and already arrived in the world. Out of those 11 new books which have the title Cultural Translation, may I recommend one to you? Because that's the one with which I most profoundly disagree. Let's give the enemy a chance. It's called Betwixt and Between. And it's about place. The word place occurs in the subtitle. Made invisible. All the politically correct talk of ecodiversity and biodiversity concerns a harmless and less problematic level of species, which is below the human. There is no corresponding desire that I can discern for cultural or linguistic diversity. Funds from all over the world, for example, are pouring into India to help save the Royal Bengal tiger. The World Wildlife Fund and many other agencies, because that is an endangered species. I love the Royal Bengal tiger, but I love the Indian languages even more. Soon we may not have any language to translate from into English, because only cultural translation will survive as a form of translation. And my suspicion is that if the Royal Bengal tiger were actually to growl in Bengali, all funds will dry up for saving him. If it were a linguistic species, then people would not want to know. It will very quickly be taught English in which to growl. This is what I am concerned about. This is what I am worried about. And it seems to me that this is what some of us should be alerted to and should recognize the great danger of. Translation without two languages. The appropriation of the phrase translation in this collocation, cultural translation, is moving in the wrong direction. It is destroying linguistic diversity. There is another, I've given examples of it, but more and more writers from all over the world are claiming that without knowing even the language of the culture which they came from, they are translating that into one of the cosmopolitan languages when they write in that language. Am I getting excited or what? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
May I say a few words?
Indeed. I hope that doesn't make you agree with us.
It does.
We shall see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it is always a great delight to listen to Trivedi's talk, but I think that he's been reading too much Homi Baba, and he has fallen into the trap he's trying to get out from. Having created a hallucinatory world, and like Don Quixote, seeing in front of his eyes enemies against which he has to fight, which don't really deserve even a minute of our attention. I mean, why worry about all these attempts? There are so many different attempts, and many words, terms, technological, professional terms are being abused in everyday parlance, in everyday language, and if we were to correct them all, if we had to react to any usage of any term, any concept in the newspapers, etc., we would simply lose ourselves in a myriad of responses. You know, I also, like Harish, has quite often the urge to react to what people write in the newspapers. I read El Periodico in Tarragona and I immediately want to write a letter to the editor about this or that rubbish being published. And like the term translation, which has been used in so many meanings since it first emerged in world history, there are so many other terms. I mean, people speak about society, about humanity, about language, about culture. Culture is one of the most abused terms around, and mostly by cultural studies. But why waste the intellectual energy on even reacting to this? Because this is a lost war. If you want to go against people in cultural studies and explain to them how wrong they are with their usage of concepts and terms, you simply aren't going to win because they are not interested in your basic framework. They are not tuned to your basic set of mind. They are not interested in the scientific project you are interested in. You want to learn something about the world. You want to crack riddles about the world. You want to solve enigmas about the world, and you are looking for the best tools with which you can do that. They are not. They simply know the answers before they even put the first question. So you can't really deal with such people. And it's a waste of time to read Homi Bhabha and his philosophies, because then you have to invest so much time to first understand what he's saying and then contest what he's saying. I would simply suggest we don't pay too much attention to it. We don't get into any kind of hysteria. Languages are not going to disappear. In spite of all the prophecies about the globalization of the world, we see all the time new groups, new nations, new local interests being defended, etc. So don't worry about that. There are even many languages around that have been revived and revitalized. Even in Spain, at the beginning of the 20th century, 2% of Basques could speak that language, 2%. Nowadays, much higher percentage can handle Basque. I don't know if this is a positive or a negative phenomenon, but this is a fact. Same in Catalonia. Although many Catalans could speak Catalan at the beginning of the 20th century, there are many more Catalans who don't only speak Catalan, but can read and write Catalan, which was not so widely spread at the beginning of the 20th century. Let us simply do our work. Let's invest our energy in doing our work. And in this sense, I completely agree with Harish. As I said in one sentence what he said then in 4 paragraphs. I mean, wasting our time on redefining the obvious. Where there is no source and target, there is no translation. Couldn't agree more. That's the basic. And if anyone wants to use the word translation for anything else, okay, let him be blessed by the gods and let him use the term. We are not affected. We need not be affected. As people use the term culture, and they speak about culture of this and culture of that, and they speak of culture as only the elite products to be consumed by elites and so on and so forth. But if we're interested, we can do our work on culture as something much larger. So I agree with you. We don't really need the term cultural translation. I simply wanted to say that sometimes, perhaps, not necessarily, you can use it. It won't be terribly useless or terribly counterproductive if you used it in these contexts where you have to explain things of one culture to the other culture. And by the way, it is true that you have to explain to the host society something about newcomers. But as Monica Rector explains in her paper, it is even more important for the newcomer to know something about the host country. It is a matter of survival for the newcomer. It is not a matter of survival for the host society. So you do have to translate for the newcomer what's going on in the host society rather than the other way around. I mean, had there been translations for the host society about the newcomers, that would have improved the relations, no doubt. But it's not a matter of survival. Many years ago, when I was much younger and had much more hair, I mean, I'm now so jealous of Harish that I mention my age again. Also, I mean, I'm also entitled to doing that. I'm not younger than him, you see.
Though he looks it.
No, I don't. I don't even do. But many years ago, when after quite many years of dealing with translation analysis, I've come to the conclusion that any theory of translation could not possibly explain what translation is all about. And then I proposed to enlarge the scope of translation analysis and create a larger framework which I called transfer theory or transfer studies, claiming that translation is only one manifestation of transfer. This does not with the purpose of eliminating translation research. On the contrary, putting translation research into a more concrete context, helping translation understand in which ways it is different from other processes of transfer on the one hand, and how it is part of transfer processes on the other. And I think we've been doing that all the time. Translation studies are almost a discipline, not always to the advantage of translation studies, because when I go to many universities now, they have created ghettos for translation studies, and as a result there is no interchange between translation studies and the rest of the universities, such as history departments, sociology department, textual departments, etc. So people say, let them do their work, we are not interested. That's also very detrimental. But again, bottom line, to conclude, I am not worried, as Harish is, because I don't read these people. I simply don't read them. I don't consider them to be part of my scientific discipline, so they are not interesting. They don't suggest anything to I mean, this beautiful poetic-like citation from Homi Bhabha can mean something if Harish gives it a meaning, but it has no meaning. It is just a conglomeration of words. It is what the French would call jonglement des mots, which is very elegantly put on paper, and the man gets airplane tickets for it and free dinners here and there all over the globe, but he has not really, I don't consider him as one who has enriched my possibilities. Maybe Harish would say I'm a narrow-minded, plain-thinking person, and I would admit to that. I wish to understand what people write. I don't wish to read texts that are incomprehensible in order to show other people how clever I am in being able to interpret them cleverly and wisely. So, because there is so much to be done, so little has been done, in spite of all our enormous work in translation research, and we can do so much better. So let's concentrate on that. Please forget about your war against the cultural translation. You've got such great talents. Don't waste them. Simply don't waste them. I mean, you can go on reading this paper, because then you can continue to be lazy enough not to prepare a new paper for new meetings. So take your paper with you and read it everywhere. But then you will simply plant fears in the hearts of people, and and deter them from doing real work. And in this sense, I'll have to fight you in a way, because why even think about that?
Thank you.
Es mi conclusión para eso.
Would you like to retort in 2 minutes?
Yes.
Podría también traducir mi texto en español si está necesario. Hay gente aquí que no entiende el inglés.
I hasten to add that Professor Trivedi's paper is on our website. All our...
And still you haven't read it.
Try.
Which means something. Why don't you draw the conclusion?
You know,
We have a short time to have a coffee break.
my dear friend Itamar does not read Homi Bhabha, but all the rest of you do not read me. So it's all right. I wish, I'm delighted to be compared with Don Quixote, especially when I'm in Spain. It was an honor that I had never dreamt of all my life. So I'm thrilled. Let me return the compliment. I do not know whether an animal called the ostrich is to be found in Israel. All right, let's not read others. Let's not read what we don't like. Let's not read what we don't understand at first sight, even though we do not very often understand the instructions and cornflake boxes at first sight.
This is a distortion. This is a distortion. This is a bad translation. This is a bad translation.
Now I've got him upset. I've been trying for some time. Yes.
I'm not upset.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely calm.
Let me tell you why it's not a wasted time to read Homi Bhabha. It's a pain. I agree. But if it were a wasted time to read people who are really influential, rightly or wrongly, and dominating the discourse worldwide, not in one but in many areas.
Is that not anymore?
Well, he's coming out with the second book very soon. So, after a gap of 20 years or something.
Like Rovira, he is in the process of being forgotten.
May I finish? Yeah.
Go
Why
ahead.
do we read Homi Bhabha? Why do we read Homi Bhabha? Let me give you a very crass reason. I've just explained the sublime reason, which is that nobody understands him, but he is very influential anyhow. Let me give you a crass reason. Of all the professors of English in the whole wide world, he's paid the highest salary. In American terms, it means he is the best and the most influential and the most profound professor of English anywhere in the world. And that is the kind of influence that he exercises. If I were paid more than Homi Bhabha, I may join Itamar in not reading him. By being paid, you know what I mean. I don't mean money. He has a kind of a clout, even intellectual clout. And the more he is not understood, the more influential he is. These are the signs of our times. This is called postmodernism. And he's the great guru of postmodernism. If we just ignore what we do not like, if we do not stand up to be countered and to oppose it, we are conniving in it. We have to take a stand. The British conquered India, and the most self-flattering version of how they conquered India was invented by one of them late in the 19th century, who said, oh, the British conquered India in a fit of absent-mindedness. They didn't even know what they were doing, and they somehow conquered India. My reply to that is, yes, the British conquered India in a fit of absent-mindedness on the part of the Indians. We were not noticing what they were doing. We said, all right, let them set up a factory there, let them occupy so many acres there, let them annex this small state while the big states are still with us. And they crept up. That's why I read Homi Bhabha.
Thank you.
I'm on the air,
Both.
yes. So I too am very happy to be here this morning, and thank you very much for allowing me in. It's not my field of study, but nevertheless it's very interesting for me. I feel that we probably spent too much time so far on terms, on the term, cultural translation, because we started off probably with the Wikipedia article. I share the feeling that it's so deficient is that article that it would be better to have nothing than that. But it worries me very much, you see, because people turn to Wikipedia. And when I say people, I mean non-specialists, students and so on. They all turn to Wikipedia these days. I think it has become the first encyclopedia, actually, for the world. And it does therefore worry very much that there isn't a good article on translation and on translation studies in Wikipedia. Because despite the explosion of translation studies in its ghettos, as you call it, and despite the prevalence of the activity and the products of translation, most people are still ignorant about translation, what's involved in it, and what it means, and so on. In places where you wouldn't expect it, where I've come up against it recently, is in studies of bilingualism. You would think that people interested in bilingualism would be some of the first to be interested in such a prevalent bilingual phenomenon as translation, but it's not so. There's a very good book on bilingualism published in Barcelona, I forget the title, probably Bilingualismo, which manages to get through about 300 pages without mentioning translation. And I wrote a few months ago to a professor in Holland who's writing a book about bilingualism and sent a material about translation. She wrote back and said, "Thank you very much. Now that I've seen this material, I will mention it in my book." So that is the state of knowledge about translation still. The term translation itself, of course, that's where the problem begins, has always been caused a lot of discussion. Where does translation end? Where does adaptation begin, for example? And beyond that, there are the extended, mostly metaphorical meanings of translation, which you mentioned. A very good example of which is translated man. Those extensions are not new, they're very old, even a theological one, actually. So these extensions are very old, and perhaps when we, I think that we're pretty much all in the same boat here. When we think about and talk about translation, we have a restricted view of translation. And actually, I'm very much concerned with something that Professor Even-Zohar touched on, which is looking at translation as just one example of transfer amongst many other. You see, the human brain can translate language and so on, but there's many other kinds of transfer. But as a translator, I'm very aware, right, of the need to do cultural translation in what would appear to be even the most prosaic of translations. I think, for example, of translating Spanish university transcripts and degrees, right? Every time I see Licenciado, I stop to think, how am I going to translate it this time? Because in order to translate it, I have to think, who are the recipients of this document going to be? What part of the world are they going to be? And in what educational culture are they going to read this? So very prosaic things like that. But here's a distinction I want to make. Most of those kinds of translational changes in the translation are on small points of the text, occasional points of the text. A very useful Spanish word here would be puntual. And there is cultural translation, I thought that's what we're going to talk about today, at a much broader level. See? Now, you do get broader in talking about that will give you cornflake examples. Because although somebody said that those were trivial examples, right, they're examples of a very widespread phenomenon in translation. It's, I think, today generally agreed in professional circles that advertising material and material put out by commercial companies for their clients and so on needs to be adapted to the readership, as we say. And incidentally, one of the norms of translation is that the translation should be readily understood and appreciated by the readers. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's one of the norms. And that's what we have to teach, at least that's what I teach in technical translation. So it means that at that level, there is actually a whole broad field of translation activity which deliberately sets out to adapt to the culture of the receiving readers. But at an even broader level, there is the question of the translation and what happens to the translations of whole literary works, sometimes a whole literary corpus. My introduction to that aspect, long before the term polysystem even existed, was when I was a beginning student of Arabic, and for light reading, it wasn't in the curriculum, for light reading I took the Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, or even more literally, as one translation puts it, the 1000 Nights and One Night. And so I looked for a crib, as I was a beginner student, I looked for a crib, an English crib for the translation, and I was amazed at what I found, and there were one or two useful to me, trying to decipher the Arabic text, but they were nothing like the ones that I was already used to from my childhood. See, because the 1001 Nights has gone through a whole process in European literature, starting with French and Galland, and then coming into English and leading to a whole range of different kinds of translations in English according to the readership for which they were intended. Popular translations which finish up on the stage at Christmas time in England as pantomimes, on the other hand, and on the other hand, Burton's translation, which for a very long time was only available by subscription to a selected group of readers. So this was my first introduction to it. Just one more example, though, that I'd like to mention, that I came across very early, was Margaret Gilman's book called Othello in French. This is an old book published in the 1920s, so the situation may have changed since then, but she comes to the conclusion that there have been quite close translations of Othello into French, one or two by famous authors, famous French authors, but as she says, nothing at all faithful to Shakespeare's play has ever been presented on the French stage. I don't know whether that's still true, but she says it's because it does not correspond. Oh, and furthermore, despite the fact that it's not the Othello story in itself, that's the problem, because there are other versions like Rossini's opera, which are very popular in France. And she comes to the conclusion, therefore, that this is because it does not correspond to the norms of the French theatre. But what it made me think was that this is a special case. I don't know that enough attention has been paid to this, the translation of drama. Because a play, dramas are usually written after order to be presented on the stage, and it struck me back then that the process of transfer, if you like, the process of transfer was not really complete until the work was presented on the stage in the target culture. And then what we do in cultures, take an Arabic translation, for example, in countries where there is no theatre. So that it never does get, in that sense, completely transferred. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that you have a whole range from very precise small points right up to transfers of whole literary works. And perhaps they shouldn't all be put into the same bundle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to comment on that?
Harish, can you use the PowerPoint?
Yes. Hold on, I've got something attacking me here. Yes. Can I turn on the PowerPoint? Harish would like to reply. That'll teach it.
I hope you can see and appreciate the tremendous amount of telepathy going on between Itamar, Even-Zohar, and myself. I did not say I wanted to reply. Itamar said I want to reply. This does not mean, don't be too optimistic. This does not mean that after I have replied, he would not want to reply. He's just letting me go first so that I'm oppressed by the passing of time and will keep myself brief so that he can respond for longer. I will respond to only 2 or 3. Yeah. I will respond to only 2 or 3 points. A whole number of points of interest were raised by someone who has obviously been thinking about all these matters for a long time, and it's wonderful to be reminded of them from time to time, that there are all these issues in translation. And in fact, to most of those points, no response is necessary except a nod of the head. But 1 or 2 things that I would like to take up are, number 1, about another aspect of cultural translation which was touched on, that we do need to translate not only language but culture. There are many situations where what seems to be linguistic translation is not adequate, but one has to pay more attention to culture. This is nothing new. Always. What is language? Language is not only the vehicle of culture, language is the main constituent of culture. So when we are translating language, we are not dealing with the dictionary. We are dealing with real life. We are dealing with all aspects of life. And therefore, this kind of a distinction that can be made, that some people wish to make between language and culture, seems to me entirely specious. In the context of the evolution of translation studies, let me point to one factor. There was a stage when linguistics was the umbrella, as I said, under which translation studies was parked, was located. There used to be a phrase used in analyzing translation, and it was, there are some culture-specific words in this passage. And culture-specific words, so-called, were supposed to present greater difficulties than all the other words. For example, in the Indian context, dharma, maya, tandoori, things like that. Because no ready equivalents were available, and the translation would have to touch upon the culture where the word comes from in order to realization has grown. As translation studies has defected or liberated itself from the hegemony of linguistics and gone more into culture, that is not only some words that are culture specific in the language. The whole language is culture specific in varying degrees. So there is no way of dealing with the language without dealing with that whole culture. And therefore, it seems to me that for the sake of argument, we may say language is one thing, culture another, but all of us who translate, all of us who read translation know that this is not so. And to raise that distinction again is perhaps to flog a dead horse. Another thing that I'd like to say about bilingualism in translation, I'm not surprised that a book on bilingualism does not mention translation. I've been saying this in the class, and I'll say it again. Never harms a teacher to repeat himself. where there is bilingualism, there is no need for translation. If you know both the languages, this is a false assumption. People keep telling me, oh, India has so many languages, so there must be a lot of translation going on. No, it's not true. If it's a multilingual situation, then people are likely to be bilingual, multilingual themselves. And if they understand 3 or 4 languages, why do they need to translate between them? As I was saying, there's a friend of mine, Sherry Simon, who has done a book on gender in translation. And after having done that, she was looking for a new topic to do for her next book. And she thought that Montreal could be written about, where she then lived. I don't know whether she still, no, she does perhaps. Yeah. And she thought that she would like to write about a book about Montreal as a city in translation. I told her she was barking absolutely up the wrong tree. My experience, my very limited experience in Montreal is everybody there understands English and everybody there understands French. So in real daily life, why do they need to translate? There is, sorry? Yeah, I should, well, no, nobody listens to me. That's my experience in life. I keep advising people, giving good free advice, and nobody takes it. One other point that I'd like to touch on before Itamar snatches the mics away from me. I like the point about theology, an older sense of translation, even before Salman Rushdie and even before other people who are entirely untheological, witness the fatwa, began using this term in that kind of a sense. There was a theological sense. And I think we should keep referring back to it. I think we should remind ourselves of it from time to time. And now there is some bad news for you. You thought that I took forever in my first intervention, and I had a paper which I read out to you, and now there is nothing left in the kitty. But there is. Now that this question has been asked, I will exploit this to read out part of a paragraph that I already have in this paper on theological translation. In early Christian use of the term, translation in the sense of being borne across took place when a dead person was bodily transported to the next world, or on a rare occasion, when his body was transferred from one grave to another. As happened famously in the case of Thomas à Becket, who was actually murdered and initially buried near the crypt of the Canterbury Cathedral, but then, about 150 years later, when the trickle of pilgrims had swollen into a big stream, Becket was moved and buried again within the same cathedral, which is where we find him now, in the grand new Trinity Chapel. The business was so good from pilgrims that the church was rebuilt on a much grander scale, which is how we see it today. And in a new place within that, and now the assumption is that that is where he was murdered. No, that's not true. That place was not part of the church. In both these senses, of bodily removal to the next world or to the next grave, we are talking of someone who is truly dead and buried. The many indigenous languages of the world and the channel of exchange between them, translation, may seem headed for the same fate in the age of cultural translation, to be dead and buried. Thank you.
Got my own microphone. Well, what shall I say? I don't think we shall allow ourselves to follow Trivedi's rhetorics, and which tended just now to blur the issues. Of course, I fully agree that language is the most important ingredient of culture, but we must distinguish between language on the one hand and culture on the other. Culture, as far as I see it, the way I see it, and the tradition in which I've been working, is the set of options for the management of life. Language is one such an option, perhaps the major vehicle for humankind to carry out strategies of action, understanding of the world, etc. But we need to distinguish between, because, as George Bernard Shaw has once said, what distinguishes America from the United Kingdom is the language. They seemingly use the same language, but it is not, because they have different cultures.
The two countries, he said, divided by the same language.
Divided by the same language.
Yes.
Thank you. Just given Professor Pym one of the pages produced by the Australian commercial company I mentioned to teach people the cultural diversity, where it says that Australians have tremendous difficulties with Americans. When they have to write a letter to Americans, or when they receive letters from Americans, they have tremendous difficulties because of the cultural difference. They don't really understand one another, not because they don't understand verbatim the texts they send to one another, but they don't understand the value, the function, the meaning of what is written. When we in Tel Aviv Tel Aviv University promotion committees receive letters from America or from the United Kingdom, we warn the members of our committees when they read letters written in English, please understand that the Americans must exaggerate, tremendously exaggerate, and praise the candidate. Otherwise, they would appear as not praising him at all, while the British always write in much more sober terms. And since we are also an Asiatic culture that tends to exaggerate, we normally do not understand the British letters, and then many committees say, well, this is not a real praise. This letter is very cool, very cold, very cold. The person is not really praising the candidate, so you must be told. You must be told. So language is not sufficient per se, unless it is taken, of course, I agree fully, in the context of culture. On the other hand, there is so much else in culture that does not derive from language, that has nothing to do with language, and so on. In reaction to what Brian Harish said about technical translation, for instance, and the need to teach technical translators how to do the job, I would like to show you, can you see this example? Two strips of paper, they're actually printed on both sides of the same strip, on a brush. That here you have some 7 or 8 languages, and I have extracted one sentence from the instructions. Please give it a moment to look and see where do you get the best instruction for lifting, for turning the brush in such a way that it can be used as it is shown on the illustration. Maybe you don't have the time to do that, so anyone can point at the clearest text. English, German, Italian, Swedish, Dutch, Spanish, and French. In all languages, it says, as seen from the illustration. As seen from the illustration. Das Bild zeigt. Lo schizzo mostra. Som illustrationen visar. That's in Swedish. The tekening tont. La base del serpillo se puede girar como muestra la figura. Como? How to do that? Only French says, si on soulève légèrement la plaque. If you lift a little. What's the plaque? What's in English, the plaque? What do they say? There's no word for it. Then you can turn it, tourner un demi-tour. When I first saw it many years ago, I was really puzzled. How come that everyone else in all of those languages, all of those cultures, can be so clever as to understand from the illustration how to go about it, while only the French text maker did not think it was sufficient for the target consumer of the brush, and that more explicit instructions need be given. And I guarantee that this is one just example out of hundreds of examples I've been sampling, I've been collecting over the years. It's always like that, or almost always like that. Instructions in French are almost always more explicit, and very often even would state the obvious. From an English culture point of view, they state the obvious. For instance, in English it would say, when there is a bottle to shake, shake well. That would be the title. The French would have secouez bien le flacon. Of course, everybody must understands that you have to shake the bottle. You don't have to shake your head. Yes, and yet the French text states secouez bien le flacon, not because of some linguistic necessity, but because this is part of what you mentioned, norm. This is a norm. The norm is to be as much explicit as possible. And I can make a little confession here. When I bought the brush, I was looking for the way to turn it around in order to go in the contrary direction and clean my dress. And I couldn't really decipher maybe I'm technically incapable, but I couldn't actually understand what I have to do. The idea of lifting the thing didn't occur to me. There used to be some old Opel cars in Germany where in order to go backward in the reverse, so-called, you had to lift the gear. You had to lift the gear. But then if you didn't know about that possibility, you would have never come to that conclusion. So I don't know whether in courses where you train French text makers, perhaps they are not translators in your definition, because there is sometimes no original text, whether they are told explicitly to do that. But probably they know to do that because it is implanted in their minds from the very first grade in the elementary school. So they get used to it, and they know how to go about it. And without some understanding of the cultural norms of French cultural norms, we are not likely to understand such tiny, seemingly insignificant events. Yes. Harish believes it's insignificant, that these are insignificant texts. I'd like to put it that they are much more significant than word literature, and then those masterpieces, some 1% of the human population may not read but have at home. Yes, these are texts people are likely, not the other texts on chocolate, etc., but these texts people must read if they want to decipher the riddle, if they want to know how to go about it.
Thank you.
I hope you like the instructions here.
3, 4. Okay, we're going to get this right up to you. You can do that. We can't record it on the video.
Shall I come forward?
Yeah, that'd be good. You can sit up there, Jackie.
No, I wouldn't go sit.
Oh, then we can all see you.
I can stand at the front here.
Good, okay. I'll sit down here.
No, I just wanted to, pick up this point that Itamar Even-Zohar made about ignoring the likes of Homi Bhabha. I think whether we like his writing and his texts or not, I think perhaps as university teachers, and thinking people, apart from that, it's perhaps our obligation to, well, and as university teachers, it's our obligation to know about what's being produced and what's having an impact in the world. After all, we're paid, at least I am, by public money. And therefore I see it as my responsibility, impenetrable as I might find him on occasions. So that concerned me greatly. And I was interested to see that Harish used Homi Bhabha in his paper. On the other hand, going to what Harish said, I felt there was a sort of tension there about using Homi Bhabha and new ideas, which may be so difficult for us to grasp, but of course in trying to express new ideas, sometimes one has to express oneself in a way which may be totally unfamiliar because one's trying to break new ground, and so language may not be invented. We have to invent new ways, and it may be, as I say, quite impenetrable initially. We just have to try harder, I guess, if we're interested enough, if we think it's worth it. And then looking at what Harish had to say, I saw that you were making a plea ultimately for translation studies as they had been understood, so that there seemed to be a tension between the new and the old. And I understand that you might be wanting to speak out for translation studies, to make a plea because you feel it's threatened. But then I wonder about this, and I'd like you to say something more about this. Do you see what I mean? I don't know if I'm expressing myself clearly. I hope so. I hope so. Enough. Anyway, thank you.
I think that's
Just a short sentence. One can read so many things. For instance, it is absolutely necessary to read Stalin's Treaty of Linguistics. I'm telling you, the little book Stalin produced, which is, by the way, of very high quality, I doubt that he had produced the book by himself, but this book has been more influential than Homi Bhabha's books for a while, for a time. We've got very little energy in our life to dedicating ourselves to reading texts, and as someone who has, as the Hebrew expression says, filled my stomach with books. Yes, I've been digesting thousands of books, I believe, in my lifetime, most of them unnecessary. I would say, well, if you want to read and give good readings to your students, and why not, I can give you a list of names. Karl Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Evans Pritchard, Roman Jakobson, Yuri Lotman would be on my list. Prior to Homi Bhabha, of course, I was overstating my case, and I'm exaggerating a bit, and I also looked myself here and there at some passages written by Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, and the rest of the gang. But I simply decided that as much as they may be interesting, that they're not helpful. They're not helpful to my work. They don't enrich it, and I don't really have to succumb to the fashion because I've been around for quite few years to realize that certain fashions simply go. And if I am patient enough and wait for 5.5 or 6 years, they will simply gradually disappear because they don't generate, these fashions don't generate the next step. In science, or even the human sciences, some kind of thinking, like Marx, generated the next step, and the next step generated the next step. That is, questions raised in one framework generated new questions to deal with, and then new questions, a new methodology, etc. In the case of these fashions, and I deliberately call them fashions, They are there only because people got tired of the previous fashion, and then they replaced them. I mean, French structuralism, which was so unhelpful, generated post-structuralism, and which was as unhelpful. And post-structuralism generated postmodernism, and postmodernism generated post-Pocot, yes, as in France, Sciences Po, you have Pocot, isn't it? Harish, they call it Pocot now.
I call it Pocot,
Yeah,
and I
Pocot.
also call it Pomo.
Pomo and Pocot.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is not long enough to say
Post-colonialism. And there was a time where you could not get a university nomination or promotion without mentioning or quoting Derrida. Now you are allowed to. I mean, there is no Derrida. When I was in America in '82, they already began to raise the name Mikhail Bakhtin. Yes, and then I realized when a certain fellow from Harvard said, as Bakhtin says, and not as Derrida said, I knew that the time of Derrida was over. You see, that's what has, I mean, I'm a bit joking about it, but it's a bloody serious matter, because I'm annoyed with this kind of work. Work that simply replaces one set of terms with another every 6 years, because you have to be dated. That's an intellectual game, and a very much justified one, because this is how things work on the general intellectual market, and in the literary market, the artistic market, etc. You must have fashions, and every generation tells you that the previous generations were a bunch of idiots, like Arthur Rimbaud expressed himself about all previous poetry. But the rules of the game must be different for academic life, for academia. They must be different. We need not copy this kind of rules, because they are not really helpful. If you want to do that, it's your business. I simply suggest we don't.
Sure.
Let's not keep going on about who should read what. I think the point has been sufficiently made. I go to many conferences, even now. Earlier it was more frequent, where somebody at the back of the room, as soon as, if I mentioned Homi Bhabha even briefly in the paper, he would say, some wise guy at the back, he would say, are there any plans that you're aware of to translate Homi Bhabha into English? I heard that so often. And it seems to me that there are two attitudes. One is to say, no, this is too new for me, this is too difficult for me, it's not worth my while, there are other things in life. The other is to see that you may be one of the very few people in this kind of a profession, the academic profession, who still wants to ignore it. How do we move forward? We may not valorize what he says. We may disagree with it. That's my whole point. I mean, Homi and I meet and we have wonderful times together, and he orders the best, the meanest muddy martini in the world, and is a wonderful facilitator of intellectual discussion, as you all know, and we have great times, and he is very good on food, ordering it, making it, cooking it. But what he's known for all over the world, except in some corners, is the kind of contribution that he is trying to make. We may disagree with it, but in order to disagree with it, in Sanskrit there is a tradition, Purva Paksh and Uttara Paksh. If you want to make an argument, your first duty is to present the other person's argument as cogently as possible. And only then do you begin to respond to it. And your own argument would sound as persuasive as you have tried to make the other person's argument persuasive. Without that, it will not sound persuasive. That is intellectual engagement. As about what is our business, what is not, there's a lovely line about what will pass. Give it 6 years, it'll pass. Give it 7 years, and I feel a 7-year itch. There are all kinds of periods that one can specify. If we wait 6 years, and then another 6 years, and then another 6 years for all these horrible things to pass, life would have passed us by. We only have a short life. How many 6 years can we afford? This is the only life we have got. There is an ideal, again in India, in Hinduism, which I am beginning to contemplate. I am the right age. He may be older, but I am getting there. The ideal is you engage with the world until the age of 50. And then in the next phase, you begin to withdraw from the world. It's called Vanaprastha, which means on the point of departing for the forest. Until I decide to depart from the forest, he says, let's go on doing our own business. What is our own business? All this is our own business. Either there is total withdrawal or there is partial evasion. Let me recite to you 4 lines of poetry which will show you that this attitude is not a Western attitude, is not a modern attitude, is ascribed to the ancient East, and even though it is put in terms of valorization of the East, it's really not. The East bowed low before the blast. We're talking about colonial conquest. The East bowed low before the blast in patient, deep disdain. It led the legions thunder past and plunged in thought again. This sounds wonderful. It doesn't mean a thing. That's why we were exploited. That's why we were colonized. That's why we have such a horrible history of being taken advantage of. If you don't wish to yield, stand up, take notice, fight.
Each one of us must decide in which framework we want to live and in which framework we want to move. If you are doing work in mathematics, you don't take notion of a plethora of writings and texts, be they philosophically rich or philosophically poor as they might be, if they do not contribute to your line of work. And this is the way physics, mathematics, social sciences, medicine, anthropology have been moving all along. I'm not saying that you cannot get enriched by general intellectual work. Yes, you can get your inspiration from various sources. You can go to the beach and get inspiration from the sea. You can talk to the fish as the saint has done once. Yes, you can do lots of things. But I think that we must put the line. This belongs to our discipline. In the Weiser says, I'm not preaching for any sort of restricted disciplines. I'm for and have been working all my life in an interdisciplinary way. But some writings simply I consider beyond the line, beyond the line. If I've got the energy, I'll read them. But they are not really strictly necessary, and there is...
I wanted to translate into Persian. Actually, many Persian speakers who were actually considered this kind of activity as a taboo in Persian culture couldn't understand what it is. So I wanted to find a solution for cultural specific words. And at last, but not least, coming to the theoreticians like Omi Baba or Spivak or Derrida, I think that they try to produce lots of thousands of literature about language, but at last they come to nothingness, because at last they say that language is meant not to be understood. It means that they try to say that by using language we try not to get understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. In my experience, limited as it is, a French kiss is not culture specific. is pretty universal. As about taboo, I was hoping you might catch on. Yes. Now, as about your other point about how translation studies and general discourse on translation should focus more on what is practically useful to translators. Well, yes, there are lots of things in life that we need practically to do. And very often we don't need any help or very little help. But then, in the present context, we're all academics. We all live in this proverbial ivory tower. And if we don't believe in this ivory tower, who will? There's a lot of life that can be led unreflectively, and some of it needs reflection and contemplation. And that is what we have dedicated ourselves to. If we need only what is practically useful, then cornflake boxes will do for us. Then we don't need to go anywhere else. On the one hand, people go around collecting photographs of cornflake boxes for 30 years, and on the other they say, let's not read Homi Bhabha because we are academics, and therefore these rules, this kind of adventure of ideas is not truly worthy of academics. There is a contradiction there of some sort. There's another part of your question implied in it, which is, why do we have translation studies? Why don't we have a manual? Why don't we have guidelines, as on cornflake boxes, about how to translate? Because people may try. Translating is slightly more complex than running your finger from left to right. And that is why there can be no one set of guidelines. That is why in every situation we have to draw upon all the resources that we have, linguistic and cultural, to stretch ourselves, to produce a translation that will satisfy us and perhaps be of some enjoyment and some instruction to others.
I think Harish is a very serious question, and I can fully identify with his criticism of much that is being carried out within translation studies. Much of the work done in translation studies is simply not only not helpful to translators, but quite often unhelpful to translators. And therefore, I can fully well think of courses for translators, not manuals about how to translate this and that. Many concepts we've developed in translation studies, translation theories are helpful, such as the concept of norms, the ability to distinguish between standardization norm and amplification norm, deletion norm, etc. If those translators who do work when they translate texts, if they do amplify the text with items that do not appear in the text because they have to follow some home tradition, become conscious, aware of what they are doing, I'm not saying they will not repeat the same kind of policies, but they will be more aware of them. And perhaps they will be more critical towards themselves. I don't really know. To tell you the truth, I've never tried to establish a department or a section in translation studies. I'm among the very few who have written their PhD dissertations in translation. My PhD dissertation is in translation. It's on an introduction to the theory of literary translation. That was the title of my PhD. So I'm very confident speaking about translation. And I had been translator myself from a variety of languages. I've been translating from English, from French, from Arabic, from Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, Italian, I don't remember, several other languages. I've been translating from these languages and published my translation. And nowadays, if I think of translating anything, I still have a dream to be able to finish my translations of several medieval Icelandic sagas. All of these translations, of course, into my own native tongue, Hebrew. I never translate the other direction. I know no language at the same level I know my mother tongue, at least not as a translator. I can see the discrepancy, and therefore I was more and more attracted to studying translation in the context of culture. What does translation do? At first, how does translation work in the context of literature? And gradually, how does translation work in the context of culture? But I'm fully aware of the fact that many translators are not interested and need not be interested. Yes, they need something else, and if you are translation scholars, you must provide them with certain tools. There are no recommendations that can be given, but of course, if you go and you become more aware of the constraints of culture, then you may become a better translator. For instance, we were discussing the other day a very famous book written by an Hungarian-British a writer, George Mikesh, who wrote a classical book about how to be an alien. And there is a chapter. In that chapter, you get some such instructions, how to make a declaration of love to your girlfriend, if you are a Britisher. And the declaration of love goes as follows. I don't object you, you know. I don't object you know. That's the ultimate. And there are many languages where you don't have the word love, you know. In Dutch, you must say, ik hou van jou. I hold of you. Yes? You don't have the word. And then the poor Dutch, think of the poor Dutch who must translate Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky into Dutch, where every other sentence has the word love in it. Yes? How do you do that? You see, you must understand that the function and the value of love, the word love and the context of love in the Russian language is completely different, so that you need not translate it verbatim, etc.
Thank you. I have something I want to say, if I may.
Oh, finally.
Finally, I think.
Here.
Do I need that? Okay. I need this to speak to this. Okay, first I want to criticize both these gentlemen for things that are puntual, as is said. You cannot say, do not worry about languages dying. You cannot do that. If, according to how you count what a language is, there are between 6,000 and 7,000 in the world. If you take the rate of language of when languages become moribund, if you take the rate of the past 20 years, before the end of this century, about half of those languages will be seriously threatened with extinction. That is a problem. The case of minor languages becoming revived, like Hebrew, like Basque, like Catalan to a certain extent, minor exceptional cases. You must be worried about the state of cultures in this contemporary world, and that's one reason for working on them, as I hope you would agree. Otherwise, why do that work? So there are serious things to take on board there, I think. And translation cultural studies may be one way of addressing those very serious problems. That's for you, sir. What did you do in class yesterday with my students, with our students?
Oh, horrible thing.
You did a horrible thing, sir. For 2 hours you discussed how many texts? 4? 3?
3 to begin with, 4 eventually.
What languages were they in? English. You analyzed literary translations solely in English. you did exactly what you're criticizing here. The source text was absent, buried, unknown, except to Özlem, who didn't say anything about it. It was for Turkish. We analyzed 3 or 3.5, 4 translations of a paragraph. Well, easy to say, but then we have, and I understand why, and you must understand why. Our classes bring together here people from many different cultures and many different languages, and we do need a way to discuss with them. So there is an increasing tendency to talk about cultural things, cultural processes, including translation, in a common lingua franca, be it English or French or German or whatever. The same thing is happening in Britain. Many students go there to study translation. They're coming in with many different languages other than English. They're obliged to work in translation. Similarly, in corpus studies, corpus linguistics, that has something to say in translation studies. The Manchester people, as you know, compare translations in English, huge corpus, with non-translations in English, a huger corpus. All done in English. But it's done in part because of globalization, because of where students want to come, to where scholars want to work, and the need to communicate in this multicultural, multi-language community and do something together. It's not altogether negative what you did yesterday. I didn't want to say that. I just want to point out that there are very good reasons why it was done.
So he's forgiven.
No, not yet. You're both, neither of you are forgiven.
Okay.
Because I think that the tendency on both sides is to ignore that something very fundamental is changing, and that is why the nature of the way we think about translation must change. And that fundamental thing is that in Western societies, at least, cultural fragmentation has reached a stage where it cannot be understood in terms of source text, target text, one language there, one culture there. When you pick up the cornflake box or the tea label or whatever, that's what a translation invites us to do.
Yes.
There's one group of people over there with a homogeneous way of doing that, and one group over there with a homogeneous way. That's what translations do. They lift and separate, as somebody said about a bra. It's a famous advertisement in my time. They extract from that point of cultural contact and overlap and infiltration and hybridity, as Baba does indeed put it, and separate them and manifest the difference. It's not translations, and I've analyzed translations to show this, are linguistically purer than non-translations, and this is what we do find. Translation is not hybridity. This is where I have problems with Baba. However, our societies are not working that way. Hofstadter's work is a falsification of the way things are working. People in IBM are in a company. They have a company culture, in addition to where they're coming from and going to. You can't just say, all Americans are like this, or all Australians are like this.
He never says that. Never says that.
But those little diagrams and those maps, and everybody wants to put them, you know, am I proximate? Am I distant? Do I believe in hierarchy? Do I, you're invited to associate with a culture. And our societies are no longer there. Something very profound is changing. Now, the people who are using cultural translation, for better or for worse, know that and are manifesting that. The best of them, to my mind, are people working in Germany, where they talk about Translationssoziologie, or Übersetzungssoziologie, but more translation. And they're specifically interested in the way that social groups reach some kind of understanding with each other without annulling cultural differences. And that, in the context of contemporary Germany, is a very valuable thing to do. Unfortunately, they think that translation, the notion of translation, implies some understanding. We, as scholars of translation, have gone beyond that, I hope. We know that translation doesn't lead to understanding, it leads to some kind of pretense of comprehension, perhaps. However, that is valuable. That's a valuable kind of sociology to be doing. And the other is also sociology. The group around Bruno Latour at l'École des Mines in Paris. Their recent book is called Sociologie de la Traduction, and their translation means the interactions that form in the nodes of networks. It's actor network theory reinvented. And again, translation is seen there more in the terms of cultural transformation, but in the terms of a fragmented society based on networks and not identities. These people are addressing what's happening in the world. Cultural translation as a term does that. I think, in contradistinction to both these gentlemen, that we can't afford to ignore it.
Okay.
There you go.
Short sentences. First, on the matter of languages. Many languages die, but many new languages are born. All the time. If you look at the map of Europe, some languages are relatively new. Italian is a new language. It was not spoken in Italy before 1860. It has taken Italian, the Italian we learn at school, to become the spoken language of Italy only around the 1980s, according to Tullio de Mauro, the great student of the history of the Italian language. This is a new language. Many new languages emerge. In Egypt, a new language emerges right now. I just heard it from a student of Egyptian culture. The new language is Egyptian Arabic. It has been a spoken language for over 1,000 years, but it is now becoming more and more powerful as a literary language. More and more novels are written in Egyptian Arabic. More and more other texts are written in literary Arabic. And before you know it, there will be a new language prepared for use for the Egyptian people. Classical Arabic will probably still be used side by side with Egyptian Arabic, but there will be a new language. Of course, you need not worry about every single language that disappears. In England, Cornwall language disappeared in 17-something when the last lady who could speak Cornwall died. Cornish. Thank you. Cornish died, and many such languages. Sometimes when a language dies, the group dies, which is then maybe a disaster. People are disinherited, people become underprivileged, then it becomes a catastrophe. Some other times, if you keep the language, I'm not sure it's for the benefit of the people. It's debatable. I'm not saying one way or the other, but at least it is a problem. When the Mi'kmaqs now received in Canada, got the right to teach their children until the 3rd grade in Mi'kmaq, I'm not sure these children will be privileged in Canadian society. What good does it make? It probably serves its function. In Asturias, I'm not sure about the usefulness of the Bable language, which I believe is also taught to children towards the 3rd grade or the 2nd grade of the elementary school, etc. Of course we need to worry about the disappearance of languages, but we need not worry as protectors of language. We need to worry as protectors of cultures. If a culture disappears with a language, but so many people have been conquered, had to change their languages, and yet did not disappear, went on developing their culture. I mean, think of the United Kingdom. The original native language of Albion had disappeared, and it has been replaced by other languages that are now spoken and that have become global languages. And to the other point you spoke about, your last point was?
Yeah, societies are fragmented, and we have to address that.
Yes.
Cultural fragmentation within our society.
Well, here again, people sometimes exaggerate the matter of globalization. There are two, and many scholars of globalizations, there's nothing original in what I'm saying right now. Many students of globalizations have pointed out that while globalization takes place on certain levels, glocalization or localization takes place on another. That is, Globalization does not necessarily delete local cultures. And globalization, in addition, is not necessarily a modern phenomenon. Only some of its characteristics are. But we have known about globalization since the dawn of history. That is, people adopted along a series of regions some culture. So yes, we need to worry about cases when the more powerful simply marginalize the less powerful, and then we lose the possibility. I mean, monotony and homogeneity are dangerous. I would subscribe to that. But when I look at the situation, global situation right now, I don't see either monotony or homogeneity rising over the globe. So it is always good to worry. I agree. Always good to worry. There is an old Hebrew saying, happy is the man who worries every day. Yes? But on the other hand, we need not worry to such a degree that we are pushing ourselves into a state of helplessness because we are already so hysterical about what is going on that we can't do anything else.
I'm not that worried. I'm not that happy either.
Good.
I think what I would say is that the categories by which we've been working have been so imbued with nationalism, with the nation state, and that category is no longer there. So we just have to move on from that.
Okay, I agree. And I have no discussion with you about the other things either.
Now that both the speakers have been suitably reprimanded by the host, we must be coming to an end. I think we have done enough, as engineered by him, to try and get at each other. And the final act, of course, was that we'll both be told off, and now we have earned our lunch. It is true that after making us fight, it is only appropriate for the coordinator to attempt some kind of a balancing act and to say whatever he wants to say, whatever he believes in a way that would stand somewhere midway between our two positions. But that doesn't mollify me. It seems to me, well, there are several points here. I'll pick up only one or two. I agree with him, and I agree even more with Itamar. Yes, languages die. Languages disappear. New languages are born. To want to preserve every language in the world may be unwittingly to fossilize some of them. I've debated this in many contexts. I've thought about it in Ireland in relation to Irish Gaelic. At a conference, I read a paper on the issue of the national language in Ireland and in India, in both of which countries it has been a failure, the idea of a national language. I agree with you about nation states, that things are changing. But who gave us the idea that one nation should have one language and one language only in one nation? It's Europe which did that. It doesn't work anywhere else, and we have begun to recognize it. But Sanskrit is a dead language. Sanskrit has been dead since the 12th century, more or less. But it's not a dead language, because I still read it, other people still read it, and what is more important is, it has, as Itamar was pointing out, been replaced by a dozen or 20 modern Indian languages which derive directly from Sanskrit. It's like Greek and Latin here. So things will change. The one law of the universe is mutability. That's not what one is talking about. One is not being fetishistic about languages. But what disappears, and how does it disappear, and why does it disappear? The native populations of so many westernized countries, Western countries in the world, have disappeared. And their languages with them. That is where one draws the line. It's already happened, one can't do anything about it. But if it happens again, that'll be a shame for all of us. What happens, what disappears is diversity. What Anthony was saying is a peculiarly Western idea. Having decimated many of the peoples and original cultures of the world, the West now says, we need diversity, we need plurality, we need many languages, we need to honor many cultures. And I'm equally suspicious. If the West wants it, there must be something exploitative and wrong with it. Why does the West want it? It has a problem on its hands. Why are there so many such successful cultural translators in Germany? Germany has guest workers, so-called phrase. Only they call it guest workers. It's very polite, it's very courteous. And they wish to honor their difference because in one of the most remarkable chapters in human history, Germans obliterated or tried to obliterate a very large section of their own population because they could not tolerate that difference. If they haven't learned from that lesson, who will? Again, it seems to me, it's not a matter only of diversity. It's not a matter whether we have 6,000 languages or 600 languages or only 6 languages. It is, of course, partly a matter of that. But more than that, it is a matter of what is the power play between those languages. How does one of those languages regard another? Is one of those languages moving in a direction which will ultimately signal the death of other languages? Diminution of power to such an extent that it will virtually be death. I do not tire of pointing out that English, the global language, has about 400 million native speakers, not counting second language speakers, in the world. Hindi, the largest language in India, has also 400 million native speakers. Has anyone ever thought of that? That they are both at the same level. Numerically they are at the same level, but in every other sense they are not at the same level. Nobody has heard of Hindi in the world. So what are we trying to do here? We are trying to preserve a genuine diversity. What is culture? Culture is never monocultural. Culture is a mixture of so many things. Even more than language, it's diverse, but in the similar way, it's hybridized by definition. So, to say let languages disappear so long as we can preserve cultures is again a paradox. Again, I go back to the fact that in these vital matters, one cannot make a terminological distinction between these two entities. What eventually one wants is, in a shrinking world, which has facilitated so many things. I quite agree with Anthony. I mean, if it were not for the English language and the fact that we can take it for granted that everybody here knows English, how would such a discussion be possible? But this is a strategic and categoristic use of the English language. If all of us, yesterday in my class, you don't know half of what happened, you only know what I told you. But in that class, we were using English, but I noticed, and I think everyone noticed, that the first language of 12 out of 14 people present, if I'm counting right, was not English. And so long as that remains the case, we have some hope. We come from many other languages and we use English and let it be instrumental in what we wish to do, rather than letting it obliterate where we come from, rather than letting it obliterate what the kind of diversity that we bring to the discourse in English. Let us distinguish between what belongs here and what belongs here. That is what we are talking about. One other word about languages. After 9/11, America is in great need of linguists. They didn't know. They didn't know there were people speaking other languages who were not totally thrilled with America. So they need to spy on the world. There are many area studies departments in America. They invented it. What are these area studies departments? They are named after a particular geographical region which has a certain cluster of languages and cultures and political aspirations and ambitions and realities which the Pentagon wants to keep an eye on. All the area studies departments were named after desks in the Pentagon. No South Asia existed before the Pentagon named it so. No Southeast Asia existed before the Pentagon named it so. And they put money in the 1960s. The turning point was the Sputnik. The Russians launched the Sputnik, and the Americans had nothing to match it with. So they began to study parts of the world which they had always ignored. Area studies departments were set up. Language learning was encouraged. After Afghanistan and after 9/11, area studies departments, which had meanwhile been languishing after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were again tremendously well funded by the State Department. These departments were funded in each university by the State Department in America, not by the university itself. This is what Gayatri Spivak is talking about in The Death of a Discipline. Finally, she's got something right. Gayatri Spivak is saying what she's talking about is not the death of comparative literature, which is the discipline that she talks about. She is talking about the death of languages. The death of languages not only in South Asia and Southeast Asia departments. And partly she is responsible, partly Homi is responsible, because even in those departments, which are supposed to be area studies departments, now people are doing theory. And if you want to do theory, you don't need to know anything about the reality of the world. It's self-perpetuating. You can sit at your computer and do it. Therefore, there is a need. And ultimately what I'll say is, yes, the West is being extremely generous. It seems to have learned something from its history. The West is extremely accommodative compared with its earlier intolerant and genocidal attitude towards other peoples and other cultures. But to whom is this courtesy being extended? Only to those who have already arrived in the West. They are at your doorstep. No, they are inside your houses. You don't have an option. If you really believe in diversity of cultures and languages, go out and extend the same courtesy and the same sense of importance to people who still have not arrived in the first world and who are not a problem for you, who are not an everyday actual problem for you. This is being forced on the West. The West is not doing it out of the goodness of its heart. The goodness of the heart will be in not only tolerating, but according real dignity to diversity all over the world. And I do not see that happening. I happen to be ready for lunch.
There are a few minutes left if anybody would like to make a comment or question. Lots of students there.
Well said. Well said.
Lots of people.
Finally, you.
One final quick comment from Professor Harris, and then we get lunch. We're almost at lunch. Don't worry. I'll just. Yeah, okay. That's.
This is actually not a comment, but a wish, a hope. See,
thank you. There you go.
Itamar, I read a review that you wrote of English translation, but in particular of an Icelandic saga. Yes. And it pleased me very much. You were very critical because of what you considered, I would say, the banality of the English in it. And I thought when I read that, well, I would like to read a translation by that reviewer. So I hope you will be able to do your translation. But then, of course, I realized, but then I won't be able to read it because it will be in Hebrew. So the only way I could read would be by an English translation of your translation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A final word? Yes, Henry.
I would like to thank you all for coming, for your patience. In order to develop a real fight between Harish and myself, we cannot possibly sit here for 4 hours. We need 12 hours. Yes, before it moves. I mean, it hasn't really begun, but as a matter of fact, we agree on more matters than we disagree. Yes, so that was a bit of a show. I mean, it was supposed to be a spectacle in some respect. And we are very grateful. I hope I express our common gratitude to Anthony Pym for having us here. I don't know if we really want to be memorized, you know, and put on a tombstone of the history of the Institute, but we are really very honored, and we have been very honored by this group of extraordinary collection of people who came from various parts of the world. The only pity is that we've been together for such a short time, so we have not been able to learn from them as much as we would have liked to. But this is a shining, bright new world. We have the internet, and we can always write to each other. That's very helpful. That has changed the world. That has allowed the underprivileged to act on equal footing with the privileged.
The underprivileged don't have computers.
Some underprivileged do. Before they have anything else, they've got computers, you know. I know it by experience. I get letters from all over the world in the email, from China, from remote places in China, from India, from Turkey, from Northern Africa, not from the first world. Not from the first world, precisely from that world where they don't have the money to buy expensive books that Benjamins produce in Holland, you know, $75, etc. And yes, that's cheap. Yes, $150 or some such, and which is why I decided many years ago, for instance, to put all my text on the web, and I urge you to do the same, including Harish. High time for you to put all your work. If you want to be read, make a website, put your papers on the website, and you will be amazed to see how many readers you will have that way. So thank you very much, Professor Pym, for having us here, and all the rest is history.
Not quite yet. I've been telling you that you have to publish a book of Benjamin's so that the cultural studies scholars will read you.
They won't.
Or Routledge even better.
Yeah.
No, you see, I once had...
Now this is a problem.
I once had a Jerusalem professor who had been my teacher who told me, Itamar, I like you tremendously. You do not read my stuff and I don't read yours.
Thank you very much.
Apart from everything that Itamar has thanked Anthony for, I have to thank Anthony for this as well. This is the latest issue of The Economist, of which he has brought a special copy, a copy especially for me. There is India, there is the tiger. India is the tiger. Let's save the tiger. Hang India. Thank you.